This is a knit garment, so our seam allowances on this are 6mm, which is 1/4 of an inch. So when you're ready, set your overlocker up with 4 threads of colour that match your fabric and set the stitch width to 6mm. In addition to this, we are going to need a plain sewing machine to help us sew some of these seams. Make sure you have a ball needle in your sewing machine so that our fabric doesn't have ladders or runs when we sew it. The other thing about this garment is you're going to need either a cover stitcher or a twin needle to sew some of the hems with. So this garment is essentially 2 pieces. There's really just a front and back which is combined, and then a sleeve, and we cut a pair of each, which means we cut one right side up and then we turn it over and cut one the other side up. So when you're ready, let's get started on sewing this garment together. So these hems have got miters in them, and it's really important that we sew everything the right way. So the easiest place to get started is to sew the centre back seam together. Now if your fabric width allows, you can just avoid this step and make sure that you put that centre back on a fold line. Making sure you remove the 6mm seam, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance from it, and that would certainly be the easiest way to go. But what we're going to do is start off by take your pattern piece and put your fabric right sides together, and then locate the centre back seam, which is this really long straight run here, and it's parallel to the grain line. So what we're going to do is match that together at the centre back neck, and we're going to sew a seam from the top to the bottom. Now with this pattern, we're not going to cut any fabric off, we're just going to let our blade of our overlocker trim any excess threads as we go in to tidy it up. Oh, I should have mentioned there is a notch to match as you go. Now the reason we've started off by sewing this centre back seam is because it's going to be really easy to start getting confused as to which is the right side and the wrong side when we do our miters. So this way you know that you can always refer back to which is the right side. So open your garment up, and we're going to start sewing the miters in the front corners. So here is my garment right side up, and this is what one of our miters is going to look like. We have 2 of them on each side. So this is what we need to sew together. What we're going to do is there's a small notch in the middle. What we need to do is match the fabric like this, and then we're just going to overlock this short edge. So as you come down to the lower centre front, you're going to see another notch here. So that's the fold position, and it's a longer seam we're going to sew this time. So with that notch in the centre, we're going to match the seams like that, and we're going to sew from this edge here through to the notch position. So what happens when we open these up? We'll be pressing them, and that creates our hem allowance there. So now you've done it on this side, we're going to repeat that on the other side. So let's do the other side. This is the wrong side and this is the right side. So find the notch position, and my notch is here. Fold that, and then overlock. Then I'm going back up right side, folding right sides together, making sure that edge is nice and matched, and I'm going to overlock. Now please just double check this before you go any further. You don't want to make a mistake at this stage. So now we're going to work on the centre back hood seam. So place your garment right sides together, and this is the hood area, and we want to overlock from here all the way around this curve, and there'll be a notch to match as you go, right down to the edge here, but no further. I'm going to start at this lower edge here. Now that lower edge here is the centre back neck. Okay, so open that hood up. So this is the seam we've just sewn, and this is the centre back neck, and it's right side down. And then take the back of your garment and place it to the centre back seam. So making sure we have right sides together, we're going to match the centre back neck of the hood to the centre back of the garment. And then as we come across the back, you'll see that it's the top of the sleeve area here, the armhole. So we're going to match that side to the other side here. So this is one of the more trickier seams we need to sew for this garment. Because of the way the seams are angled, if you drew a seam line down, the actual sew position for this is around about 1.5 centimeters, which is 9/16 in from the edge of this corner. So the easiest way to sew this seam is going to be to stretch it out as you go. Now that can be quite tricky if you're new to using an overlocker, so you might prefer to go to a plain sewing machine and stitch that into place. So what we need to do is making sure there's no ease on this side, so that will come to here and this will come to here, and then what we need to do is stretch this seam out like that, and we need to try and sew this as much in a straight line as we possibly can. So how does this work? Well, let's start on this side, so making sure we have right sides together. We're going to start on the shoulder seam on the armhole side. So sew a couple of stitches just to hold that into place. And then sew along there, and don't stretch it out at all. Just make sure that those seams match. Now, as you can tell, we're getting to the shoulder neck point here on the back. So that point there, if you can imagine 6 mil, which is 1/4 of an inch in there, that sew position there needs to sew to pretty much 9/16 an inch, which is that position there on this piece. So we have to make sure when we sew that those pieces match, and the easiest way to do that is to try and make it into as much of a straight seam as we can. So I'm going to overlock up to it, and when I have that position, I'm just going to rearrange my work and then overlock through to the centre back neck seam, making sure you take out your pin and that those two seams are sitting exactly on top of each other. And it's a good idea to make sure the seam on one side faces a different direction from the seam on the other side. Now you can go back and check your work, and if you've missed that, you can go to the plain sewing machine and just stitch a few stitches just to make sure that you've caught that properly. And I promise you that's the trickiest part about sewing this garment, is getting that seam accurate. So now we just have to repeat what we've done in reverse to come out the other side. So here's our shoulder neck point there. Now the reality is this seam is actually quite well hidden under your neck, so if you do make a mistake, you're not really going to notice it. Which is a terrible attitude to have, I know, but when you're learning to sew, sometimes these things can be a bit tricky. Okay, so I'm going to match the other shoulder there. And I'm going to try and just straighten out that seam as much as I can with my overlocker. And just make sure that both edges of the shoulder where the sleeve's going to be sewn into, which is the crown notch on the sleeve, make sure those edges are even. That's really important. Right, so when you've sewn that, just double check your work as I said, and if you need to go over that with your plain sewing machine, but basically that's what we're looking for. An evened off or a curved corner. And so this is the centre back, looking at it from the back point of view. So now we're going to sew the sleeves in, and let's have a look at the sleeves. We've cut a pair out, which means we've cut one this way and then one this way, so it's known as a mirror. That's because the sleeves aren't symmetrical. We have more room at the back to allow for movement in our arm. When we look at the sleeve, at the centre top of the sleeve we have a notch which is called the crown notch, and that needs to match to our shoulder seam of our garment. And then as we come down one of the sides, you'll see a notch here which shows us the back of the sleeve. So that's how you'll know which is the which sleeve goes in which side of your garment. You need to make sure that that notch matches into the back armhole notch of your garment when you have your fabric right sides together. So let's start from the beginning. Take one of your sleeves and fold it right sides together, and we're going to sew this underarm seam here, from the underarm right the way down to the wrist. And do exactly the same thing with the sleeve on the other side. So fold your fabric right sides together and sew the underarm seam. So now, because I'm here and it's easy, I'm going to stitch the wrist area with my overlocker. Now if you're using a cover stitcher, of course you could just cover stitch that hem in now, or if you're using a twin needle, your call there. So what I'm going to do is just overlock the raw edges of that. And the hem allowance on the sleeves is 2.5 centimeters, which is 1 inch. Right, so I'm going to take my sleeve and turn it right side out. So take your garment and with wrong sides out, take a sleeve and place it inside. Now you've got a 50-50 chance of picking up the right sleeve. So what we want to do is place the sleeve inside our garment, making sure our back notches match. So we're going to make sure the seam we sewed to our sleeve matches the underarm notch there on our garment. We need to make sure that the back notches match the back of the sleeve, and then that crown notch on our sleeve needs to match to the shoulder seam on our garment. And we're going to make sure that that seam faces towards the back when we sew it. So those are our ease positions. Now, because the body of the garment doesn't have an underarm seam, the front and the back are all in one, I'm going to start overlocking this just from one side of the side seam notch, even though there is no actual side seam. Now, when I'm sewing this in, it's often a good idea to make sure you overlock it so that the sleeve is on top. Just makes it a little bit easier to maneuver this. So here is my underarm position here. I'm just going to take out that pin. I'm just sewing a few stitches just to anchor my work into position, and that works like another pair of hands and just lets me move things around. So any stretch needs to be distributed evenly between these pin points. So I'm going to take the next pin out, which is my back notch, and just making sure all my edges are even. I'm going to overlock up to that notch. Then I'm stopping, and I'm going to arrange my work up to my shoulder, which is my crown notch position there. And then I'm going to overlock that up to the shoulder. Now for the front of my sleeve, I just need to make sure that that's evenly distributed as we go down. And then just double check your work to make sure that you haven't missed any fabric. Right, so now you've done it on this side, let's just repeat for the other side. So now if you have a cover stitcher, you can jump this step, but what I'm going to do, because I'm just going to use my plain sewer to sew my hems in, I'm going to overlock around the entire outside of my garment. Now when I overlock this, I'm going to start from the center back hem, the lower center back, and I'm going to make sure I overlock with my garment right side up. When you come to these inside miters, make sure you just create a curve and don't catch any of the other fabric. So now I'm going to take my garment across to my iron and I'm going to press the hem allowances in. Now the body of the garment has 3.5 centimeters, which is 1 3/8 of an inch, and then the seam allowance for the sleeves is 2.5 centimeters, which is 1 inch. So I'm going to go and press those into place before I go ahead and stitch this. If you have a cover stitcher and you've skipped this step, just go and cover stitch that at 3.5 centimeters for the body and 2.5 for the sleeves. So I'm just going to do a quick recap in a different colour so you can see what we should be up to at this stage. So here is, and this isn't the whole garment, this is just a sample of one of the corners. So here is the mitre we've sewn. It's much easier to see in a contrast colour. And so the mitre has created our hem allowance here. So the next thing we need to do is run our overlocking through the outside of the entire garment. So I suggested it's a good idea to start at the hemline, at the centre back hemline. So when you get to the mitre edge there, you just want to create a nice smooth corner there. If you need to trim a little bit off, that'll be fine too. Just don't trim off too much and make sure you don't get any of this fabric caught up as you go. Okay, so that'll give you enough to show you what we're going to do. So this is the stage we're at here. So now you need to go to your iron and turn up that hem allowance, which is 3.5 centimeters, and press that into place. So the next thing we're going to do is stitch a line of stitching through that overlocking there. And if you want to, you could do a second line of top stitching as a decorative feature as well. So I suggest you start and finish that top stitching also at the centre back hem, and make sure that you have a full bobbin and a full top stitch thread in your machine, because there's nothing worse than having to join it. Now remember, this garment, you're actually going to see the inside of the garment because this is the collar, it's turning back like this. And this is just one of the two ways you can sew this garment. In a minute I'll show you the other way, and the other way is just simply a double turn. So the other way, we're going to turn that under instead of overlocking the edge and stitch it like that. So it's up to you depending on the way you want the finished garment to look. This way is really easy. The double turn can be a little trickier, but it's only marginally trickier to do. So let's go to our plain sewing machine and stitch this into place, but just remember to press that 3.5 centimeters now and make sure it's even the whole way around. Now I've got a light grey thread here in my machine. I'm just going to leave it as that because this is just a sample to show you what we're doing. You can tell here how important it's going to be to make sure you're overlocking straight, and if you go slightly out with your overlocking, what you can do is when you iron it, you can make sure that that is evened up into place. Now clearly I haven't ironed this. Now what you need to do is we're going to sew the stitching through the overlocking line to hide it. Now you may need a silicone foot or a roller foot on your machine, and at this stage it's really important that you check your stitch length and your stitches before you start sewing to get the best result. Now we want to avoid tunneling, which is those wavy lines as we stitch this. All I can do is say take your time and don't stretch this out too much. Of course, if you have a cover stitcher, you'll find it really easy to do. So all we want to do is just a nice straight line of stitching through the centre of that overlocking. And if you do find that the fabric starts bunching up, just lift your presser foot to release any of the tension. We just want to create a nice straight line. So as we reach the miter position, we want to stop with our needle down right in the centre of that line of stitching there. With your needle down, lift your presser foot, turn and pivot, and then rearrange your work. Now, as I said, this isn't the real garment, this is just a quick sample I cut out just to show you what we're doing. And then continue stitching. Now when you finish, go ahead and give this a press again with your iron. Make sure you test press a spare piece of fabric before you do that. You don't want to end up burning your fabric or melting your fabric if there's any sort of synthetic content in it. So that's what we're looking for when we're finished. Now remember, as I said, the inside of that is going to be seen because the collar turns open like that. But this is definitely an easy way of sewing this. So before we jump on to sewing the sleeve hems, I'm going to show you how we can sew this garment using a double fold. So to sew this garment with a double fold edge, which I personally feel is a tidier finish to it, we're not going to use the overlocker for the miters. So what we're going to do is, at the miter position, so fold right sides together, match the outside edge of your garment, and make sure that that notch is at the centre of the fold. Now we're going to stitch the miter through, making sure it's a 6mm, which is 1/4 of an inch seam. But because we want to fold this under, we need to stop 6mm 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Now this is patterned for 6mm 1/4 of an inch. You actually could get away with stopping 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch if you prefer. It's really got, I mean, I should say it will make a difference, but it's really not going to make a huge difference if you prefer having a deeper turn back, just because sometimes it's easier to work with. So we're going to stitch through this, don't forget to back tack, and you need to make sure there's a ball needle in your machine, and stop 6mm before the end. Right. So what this does is when we open up our miter and we turn it through, let's turn it this way, actually it's probably easier to see. What this has given us is room to turn that back under to press. Now because I've actually patterned this for 6mm, you will have a teeny bit of extra fabric there, but that's all fine. So what we're going to do is go to our iron, and now you're going to press the entire outside edge under 6mm 1/4 of an inch. So when you come back, what you will be left with is a nice edge ready to top stitch. So this will all be pressed under like that. And if you stitch just short, so short of the raw edge, which is the 6mm 1/4 of an inch, it gives you a really good place to be able to press to. So I'll go ahead and press this, and I'll come back and I'll show you what we're doing. Right, so I've pressed the edge under 6mm and then pressed my hem allowance in, and as you can tell, and this is just a good old plain cotton lycra, which by the way, something of this weight, just something with a bit of body will be really good for this design. Don't go too thin, just because it's more of a jacket or coatish shape. It probably is better something with a little bit more structure. So this gives you a really good edge to top stitch along, gives you a nice clean line, and personally I prefer this finish better. It is going to take you a little bit more time than just cover stitching down, but it's really whatever you prefer. So all we need to do now is just to edge stitch there. So edge stitch is literally just using the edge of our presser foot to stitch along. So stop when you reach the very centre of that stitch line, lift your foot, turn and pivot. And as I said, take your time when you're sewing this, and make sure to release the tension on your foot as you go. So it's literally this, and this is the same on a domestic sewing machine or a commercial sewing machine. You often need to lift the foot to release the tension underneath, and that will just help stop any tunnelling or roping. And so go give that a press, and that will come up really well. So that is what we're looking for. So that's what it's going to look like on the right side of your garment, and this side will only show if the hood's up. If you've got your hood back on your back or off your head, most of the time the garment's going to sit open like that. So for the sleeve hems, now if you have a cover stitcher, you can simply just turn this up at the notch position, which is 2.5 centimeters, 1 inch, and stitch this. And if you don't have access to a cover stitcher, I strongly suggest you use a twin needle on a domestic sewing machine. The twin needle will give you some flexibility with this. If you put your hand in and stretch this too much using just a plain stitch, this seam can snap, which means the threads break when you're wearing it. So if you put too much pressure this way, so I strongly suggest you use a twin needle or a cover stitch machine if you have access to one. If you don't, you can use a ball needle on your plain sewing machine. Just be very careful with that hem when it's under pressure. So we have a notch just up from the raw edge, and this notch is at 2.5 centimeters, which is 1 inch, and you should be able to see it through your overlocking. So that shows us the turn position for the hem. Now these sleeves are just slightly longer than normal because this is cut more like a coat than a cardigan, so the sleeves are supposed to be slightly longer than normal. So what we're going to do is turn at that notch position, 2.5 centimeters, and if you find it easier, go to your iron and just press that hem allowance into place. So I'm doing this just on a sample because I didn't realise quite how hard it was to see sewing the darker fabric until I reviewed the video, so that's why I've switched to doing the samples instead of doing an entirely new garment. So to sew the sleeve hem into place, it's much easier if you turn the garment so that it is right sides out, because what you can do is just slide it under your foot like this as you go. So when you start sewing from the seam line here, the underarm point, sorry, the underarm seam. And when you start sewing, don't forget to back tack and just tuck under those overlocking threads. If you cut the overlocking threads, they can fray back, so it's a good idea to just tuck those under when you sew. And don't forget to pre-check your stitching on some spare fabric before you sew on the final garment. So you want to check the stitch length and also check that the tensions are correct. And just remember, if you have a problem with the bottom, it's generally a top thread issue, and if you have a problem with the top, it's generally a bobbin issue. It's a quick way of adjusting your tensions while analysing what's wrong with them. So stitch your first line of stitching through that overlocking line, and don't forget to back tack. And for the second row of stitching, if you choose to do it, turn it back through so you can see the first line of stitching, and then just sew a second line parallel to the first, and just use your presser foot as a guide. And when you stitch through the bulk of the fabric, so stitch on the side closest to the fold. And don't forget to press that into place. And as you can tell, when you adjust the stitch length slightly, it gives you a bit of give, so it's not like it's going to snap like a woven fabric would if you stretched it. It will give you a slight bit of give, but I strongly recommend using a twin needle, or even if you have a stretch decorative stitch on your plain sewing machine. So that's our garment finished. Thanks for joining me with a sew-along video. The shape of this garment is quite coat-ish rather than cardigan-ish, if you know what I mean. the shoulders are set more like a coat. So I really hope you enjoy wearing this. It'll be a great addition to your winter wardrobe. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for the support, guys. You're just great to deal with in my Facebook group. Really lovely bunch of people. And I hope you join me for my next sew along video soon. Thanks.